All right. All right. Welcome to probably the last episode of the Tank podcast ever. I'm sure that we're going to be canceled after this.
Don't start like that. Restart.
Warning to everybody. Not to get offended. We're going to talk about stuff. Obviously, the only thing that's in the news is protests and riots and all of that type of good stuff. So we're going to talk about it, right? We've got nothing pre-planned here, really. Just a couple of notes of topics we want to talk about. I don't know what anyone's going to say. You don't know what I'm going to say. So please don't send in your hate emails if you get offended. That's all I'm going to say. So yeah, we're going to talk about all of that stuff and more on episode 246 of the In the Tank podcast. As always, I'm your host, Donald Kendal. Joining me, I've got Justin Haskins, editorial director. That's right. The Heartland Institute. How are you, good sir?
Unacceptable, Donald. Unacceptable.
Well, you've already upset like most of the country just by wearing that hat. So
that's true. I am trolling all of the football universe by wearing this hat. But the thing I like about this hat is that not only does it represent winning and victories and success, but also America. So it's really like it's a patriotic hat / it's also
joining us. We have Isaac Orr, policy fellow at the Center of the American Experiment. How are you, good sir?
I'm doing great. And the thing that I love about this cup is that it represents all that's good in the world, like the Green Bay Packers, because
also
they have more championships.
We have Jim Lakely, VP of the Heartland Institute. You have your Pittsburgh mug. And he's muted.
He's muted.
He does have the Pittsburgh mug.
I do have my Pittsburgh mug.
The funny thing is, this was not planned. So this just happened to be this way. This is pretty amazing.
Well, actually, Justin, for people, not everybody that listens to the podcast actually watches the videos. So what you actually described on your head was a MAGA hat.
It was not a MAGA hat.
You sure?
The New England
MAGA
Patriots
hats are
hat.
just ridiculous. It's New England Patriots.
You said it represented winning and patriotism in America. So yeah,
and everyone knew right away that was a Patriots hat. They didn't.
And in the dark corner of his apartment is Andy, producer extraordinaire. This is already off the rails. Maybe we should just keep going off the rails.
We've already lost it.
So we don't have to talk about anything. How about that? I will say, I did get my wish of not having to talk about coronavirus anymore. Because if one thing solves coronavirus, it's nationwide riots. So that's good.
Careful what you wish for, I guess.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, it's one of those monkey paw wishes.
It's a monkey paw wish for sure, Donald. For sure.
That's what you get. That's what you get.
God damn.
Oh, man. Remember the good old days when we could just talk about, climate alarmists?
Oh, man.
How silly they were.
The climate town hall on CNN. Remember when that was
fun.
That was
a fun episode.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was just mentioning to the guys that I was cleaning out all my screenshots because one of the things that I do on my phone is if I come across an article or whatever that I want to talk about on the podcast, I'll screenshot it. So I've got a million screenshots. So I was looking through and I found the NBC climate confessions a year and a half ago. And I had a couple of them screenshotted because I remember talking about it on the podcast episode. And my favorite one, the one that I never deleted, is I like my house to be 85 in the winter and 55 in the summer. Deal with it, hippies. That's what the show used to be about.
Yeah.
Now we have to argue about lockdown orders and talk about crazy protests and riots. Is there any other tangents you guys want to go on before we actually
lockdown is over now, right? I mean, lockdown has been suspended for, a couple of weeks now. So I don't see how, these lockdowns and these phases that everybody was trying to, praying to get into one of these days so that you could actually get back to some semblance of real life. All that is out the window now, right? I mean, that's what I see on my television every day. The media and the experts and Dr. Fauci and everybody and my governor, Commissar Pritzker, told us that we were putting people in danger. You were killing grandma by going outside, by gathering in groups of more than 10, by playing doubles tennis with somebody who isn't in your family, by getting your hair cut. You are putting millions of people in danger of death. But apparently that doesn't apply anymore. I guess maybe it was all fake. I don't know. Maybe it was fake. What do you guys think?
You got your monkey paw wish too. They stopped talking about those lockdowns.
I haven't stopped thinking about those lockdowns because I am still in lockdown. The state of Illinois is still in, we are still lacking our full freedom of motion, of movement, of commerce.
Phase 3, which is actually phase 1. They're saying that it might be phase 4 by the end of the month. We'll see.
Oh, gee, golly, I hope so. That would be great. Although all I see on TV is there are no phases at all.
Yeah.
Everything is fine now, apparently. Right?
All right. Well,
I do think that one thing that's kind of interesting about that is here in North Carolina, they very recently President Trump announced that the Republicans are going to be pulling their convention out of North Carolina and going someplace else because essentially the governor here said that you can't have a group of people that's like 150 people or more than 150 people, I think is what they said. And so that they can't have the convention here unless they're willing to limit to 150 people, which of course, if you're going to do an in-person political national convention is basically impossible to do. So that's interesting since the governor, I think yesterday came out, it was either yesterday or the day before, and marched with a bunch of protesters out onto the streets. And we've got protests here with more than 150 people all over the place. And so why is it okay for protesters to gather in the street and protest, but it's not okay for Republicans to gather in a convention center and have a convention? I don't understand the difference whatsoever. The governor, by the way, when he was protesting, was not social distancing, unfortunately. And even here in the city that I live in, which is not a massive city, they've had several nights of protests here. And the protest that I saw yesterday had at least 300 people, at least, in the streets, all gathered together. No one was social distancing or very few people. And so, I think it's a fair question to ask. If supposedly that was such a national health emergency that we were going to shut the entire economy down, we were going to basically choose to have a Great Depression level economic crash, because it had to be done for public health, then why is it that we're allowing this to happen now? I don't understand why someone's right to protest is more important than someone's right to just gather with their family members or have a business or do any other sorts of things like that. So that is a very fair question. I don't know how they're going to answer that. I've yet to hear anyone really provide a very good answer for it. So,
well, I think here in Illinois, they're not going to answer it at all. And in fact, I think it's very likely that our governor, Commissar Pritzker, will declare, well, because people have been out and about and, not social distancing out on the streets for protests and other activity that is not peaceful protesting, but quite violent rioting in the city of Chicago, because that was permitted for the last week or two. This now, hits the reset button. Now we're actually in more danger. And so not just the people out on the street need to quarantine for 2 weeks or maybe a month, but I think for public safety, we're going to have to go backwards again. We're going to have to, stay locked down and maybe even increase the lockdowns just for public safety. I think that is much more likely than not to happen. I think the argument will at least be made. I don't watch Governor Pritzker's, daily press briefings or however often he has them on the COVID-19 crisis because I don't like to torture myself. I will read about it later. But this whole thing is so. There are a lot of people in this country. Obviously, almost every single American in this country is extremely empathetic and realizes and knows in their hearts and feels horrible about the tragedy that happened in the hands of police with George Floyd. There's not a single decent person in this country who is not horrified by what happened. But for the governments to just say, okay, well, then everybody can take to the streets and all of the social distancing is canceled, all of the lockdowns are canceled, all the restrictions on movement are canceled, because this is important enough. There are many, many people in this country who had loved ones die alone in hospitals. They couldn't be visited by their family for their last days. They died utterly alone, laying in a bed for days, sometimes weeks on end, with no ability because of the government's imposition of basically house arrest for any of those family members to hold the hands of their mothers as they passed away. They couldn't go to funerals with more than 10 people in them, or they basically had to cancel funerals altogether. because so they couldn't have the funerals that their mothers or their fathers had wanted or their grandparents had wanted. They couldn't bring people together to remember and celebrate their life and mourn together and say goodbye. All of that was illegal in this country. Yet we've seen for the last week to 10 days that seems to be very arbitrary. I think it's very important to a lot of people to be able to hold the hands of their loved ones as they die in a hospital. I think that's pretty darn important. And the government just said, nah, you're not able to do that. In fact, we'll arrest you if you want to do that. And then speaking just of protest, there was a woman in, Tucker Carlson mentioned this on his program the other night. There was a woman in New Jersey who wanted to organize a peaceful protest about the lockdowns, demanding that they end in the state of New Jersey. She was arrested. She was arrested for trying to organize a protest against the lockdowns. And yet here we've had, almost 2 weeks of righteous First Amendment protected protests against a grave injustice in this country. And that's fine. This arbitrary, unfair application and revocation of our rights and then allowing other people to exercise their rights is not going to stand very well for a lot of people in this country. I think any fair-minded person would look at this and then look at their governments and say, you're not fair. In fact, you're almost not even legitimate. If these people think they're going to get a lockdown number 2, a second lockdown going on in these states, that is just not going to happen. You're going to see broad civil disobedience pushing back against this because it's not fair and it's frankly un-American.
So let me ask you, Jim, are you upset more at just kind of the double standard, the perceived double standard of allowing one protest to happen and one not, or are you upset with the current protests?
I'm not upset with the current protests at all. I think that's great that they're out there on the streets. They should demonstrate against what they see as an injustice. That is a very American thing to do. I've been mad about the lockdowns from the beginning. So I'm mad about the inconsistency and the hypocrisy and the inconsistent application of the law, the revocation of the rights of some, but the allowing others to enjoy their full rights as Americans under the Constitution. So the shutdowns should not have happened. We're seeing data that has come in now over the last 3 months. Sweden didn't have lockdowns like this. They did not experience some kind of Black Death plague in their country. And then we see now, as the data keeps coming in, these lockdowns were not medically or scientifically necessary. It seems that the difference. In fact, I saw this the other day, and I didn't share a link with you guys, but that Neil Ferguson in England, whose report said that 2 million people would die in the United States if we didn't lock down, and 500,000 people in the United Kingdom would die if they didn't completely lock down and shut down their economies and basically destroy their economies, or at least temporarily, and imprison people in their own homes. If we didn't do that, 2 million people died in the United States, 500,000 people died in the UK. He said just the other day, you know what? Seems like I was wrong, that the lockdowns didn't have any effect whatsoever, really, on the transmission rate, infection rate, and death rate of COVID-19. Oh, gee, sorry. Hey, mistakes happen. Sorry, world. I didn't mean to, I guess we'll get it better next time. 41 million people in America were jobless. The economy retracted by 5%. This is a global economic disaster. It's like, oh, well, sorry. I guess it didn't have any effect whatsoever. So yeah, I mean, I've been mad about the lockdowns from the beginning because the early indications were that this was big time overkill.
I totally get the frustration at the double standard. Like, basically what happened with this is, as a society, people made a decision that protesting the murder of George Floyd was worth the potential spread of the coronavirus, right? I mean, that's basically the only way that you can look at it. You can say, look, before we thought that this was the most important thing was staying home, and now we realize that there are other priorities that come along. But like, for me, what's frustrating is how come they get to decide? Or, how about like running and maintaining the business or providing for your family? Like, that's not something that is worthwhile. So I think that's really where, like, personally I get frustrated, because like I am not against the protests at all. I think the protests are great. I think that's exactly what people should be doing right now.
Right. Okay. You know what? To that point, because you make a totally solid point. When the protests over the lockdowns were happening, it was the media was trying to portray it as like, oh, these people just want haircuts. Right?
Yeah.
All boiled down to something as silly as they just want haircuts. I will point out that Jim looks like he got a haircut, so maybe they weren't completely wrong.
I
But
did.
yeah, no, there was legitimate things to be concerned about. People's businesses that they put their savings into that were just watching it just collapse.
Well, generations of work, and sometimes, right? Like you got, bakeries and stuff like that where their grandparents started it and it's still in the family. So like to pretend that there's no emotional toll that goes into watching a business like that just disintegrate because of restrictions from the government on coronavirus is just like it's obtuse is basically what it is. It's just a willing disregard of that, saying, hey, sorry, our priorities are more important than your priorities, so deal with it.
Yeah, and I think we all know people who, are in that situation, not even necessarily just business owners. I mean, I've got a very close family member who had her dream job, been wanting this job her whole life, finally got this job, and it was in event planning in a major city. They did weddings and stuff like that, big events. And of course, what happens when you have a shutdown of everything? What's the first thing that they stopped doing for a coronavirus shutdown? Events. Yeah. So all the events stopped and she got laid off. Oh, she was one of really in the first wave of people who got laid off because of course you can't have events like this. And so people's dreams, I mean, really a lot of people's dreams were crushed by this. And there are times when you have to do that because there's just a public health risk or a risk to the public just in general that makes it absolutely necessary to do something like this. But you have to be certain that that's the case. And I think what we know now, beyond any doubt whatsoever, is that in many places in the United States, there was no reason to shut the economy down completely. And when I say many places, I mean the vast majority of places in the United States, more than 90% of the places. I mean, unless you live in the New York City metropolitan area or in certain other very high density urban areas.
Yeah, New Orleans.
There really was no reason for it outside of those areas. In those areas, you could make an argument that at least for a certain period of time, it was worth doing. But outside of those areas, no, there's no justification whatsoever. And we never saw, as Jim pointed out, we never saw the numbers that we were told we were definitely going to see, no matter what. That's the important thing to remember. All these models told us that no matter what we do, we could do anything. It wouldn't matter. We would at least see X number of people dead, 200,000 people dead, or whatever I think that was the minimum, 200,000 people, and it's like, that just didn't happen. We didn't see our hospitals get overloaded with people in the vast majority of places. Even in the worst hit places, only some of the hospitals got overfloated with people. So the idea that this was 100% necessary across the entire country is totally false. It has been completely disproven now. And if we're going to learn anything from this lesson, I hope it's that the American people learn you cannot trust models to predict the future perfectly. And you shouldn't base all public opinions on models because models can be and often are flawed. Rarely are they right. It's very hard to predict human behavior. It's very hard to predict how people are going to react to certain situations. It's very difficult to produce a model that is as complex as the kinds of things that we're talking about here, that's going to predict the future. It just never works out that way. And as a result of that, as a result of relying on these models, I mean, there were a lot of people running around saying, well, this is science. We're going to learn. Yeah. We're going to learn whether Americans really believe in science. That's what we were told. And if you denied the models, you denied science. When the models they're not based on a scientific method. I mean, there's nothing scientific about a lot of the models they were wildly off.
Yeah.
So,
at least the scientific method would dictate that if your models are off, you need to change your assumptions in order to make them more accurate. So
that's right.
I mean, you have to test your hypothesis, and if your observations aren't supported by the data that you find, then your hypothesis is wrong. The model was bad.
That's right.
But is anyone going to learn from this though? I mean, I just had this vision that you guys were talking about climate change policy and all of that. So you could like superimpose that entire thing you were talking about, models and basing public policy off of those models onto climate change. So is anybody going to admit, that anyone that was making this policy based on these models, anyone going to admit that they were wrong
I
and
think
try
that
to change their ways in the future?
I think if it is going to work, if, reason will prevail in saying that models are not good enough in order to make policy now, especially for something that's so rapidly changing like coronavirus, or something that's so distant into the future like climate change, then I think that this helps demonstrate the fact that, look, models are not always accurate. So I think that it's a better, people at least understand that models can be wrong, and those models being wrong can have really bad implications. But does it happen? I don't know. But at least we're in a better position today than we were before the coronavirus hit.
I just don't see like any public figures, Fauci's of the world, or even the media that was like treating what he had to say as gospel.
Well, of course not. They're politicians. Like, they're going to say whatever they need to say to cover their own butts.
Well, I'm saying even like CNN, or whatever, just like the media. They're not going to admit this. It's going to move on to the next story.
Yeah, but I don't think that matters. I think what matters is, are the American people going to believe it still? And I think that there is an element of the public that you can remind them of this in the future and say, remember when they told you that 200,000 people were going to die? Remember when they told you that every hospital across the country is going to be flooded with people, and that they wouldn't be able to take, people who got into car accidents because every hospital bed would be full? Remember when they promised you that this was going to be the case, that all these people were going to die? We could have hundreds of thousands of people dead as a result of this. And that, the predictions about transmission rates and about survival once you actually get the disease and all of these things. Remember all of that? That didn't work out. That wasn't true. And I think you will get a lot of people who say, yeah, you know what? That's true. Why should we trust these people? If anything, we already had in America a very low level of trust in our institutions across the board. And all this did was prove that that's totally justified. Like, why should we trust the FBI? Why should we trust why should we trust people making these kinds of models? Why should we trust the so-called, like scientific experts who supposedly know everything that's going to happen to us in the future, both 2 months in the future and 60 years into the future and beyond? Why should we trust those people? And I think there's a lot of people out there who are going to say, you know what? I think we should listen to them, but should we trust them and treat everything they say as though they can predict the future perfectly? No, absolutely not. You don't need to ignore experts. I'm not suggesting that, but we shouldn't just assume that the experts are always going to be right. And I think this has proven that in a way that everyone can actually has experienced personally. And so I think it will stick with people in a way that other times where this has happened, it hasn't.
Maybe, but I still think that it's not going to be like a bipartisan lesson that's learned here.
No,
I think that there's still going to be the other half of the country that says, if we didn't do all of those things, if we didn't shelter in place and all of that stuff, then it would have been 2 million people died, and we would have seen mass chaos at hospitals and all of that.
But what happened in Sweden disproves that, because Sweden went the opposite direction. They didn't force people to stay home. They just didn't do that. And although Sweden, the death rate in Sweden from coronavirus is higher than it is in the United States.
Yep. It's got one of the higher per capita death rates in the world.
It does. It's lower though than a lot of than several nations that locked everything down. So Italy, for example, Spain, United Kingdom, they all have per capita death rates that are higher than Sweden. And although they do have a relatively high per capita death rate compared to some places, they don't have it's not like everybody's dead. It's not like the whole society got wiped out, and their economy is a lot better off than a lot of other places. In fact, I saw an article a couple weeks ago that said that their economy actually grew. So I don't know, not very much, but a little bit, while all these other economies shrunk. So there was a balancing act there that they decided, rather than commit economic suicide, to try to stop coronavirus. We're not going to commit economic suicide. And instead, we're going to allow people to have more freedom than a lot of these other countries around us. And although you could argue maybe that wasn't the right decision, I don't know. The point is, it didn't result in the horror story that we're told was going to happen. I mean, it just didn't happen. In fact, I don't know for sure. I don't have the New York number in front of me right now, but I'm willing to bet the per capita death rate in New York City, where they locked everything down, was relatively comparable to the Sweden per capita death rate. I bet you anything, it's almost the same. And so how can you explain that then? How do you explain that? So I just don't think that you'll get a lot of people who you'll always get some people who want to go that route, but I don't think these elections aren't decided by them. Those people are already voting for the far left people, the vast majority of them. We're talking about people who are in the middle that decide all the elections, that really decide the shape of public policy in America. They're the ones that everyone's trying to win over. And the question is, how will those people feel about all of this? And I think that a lot of those people are realizing that a lot of this stuff was blown out of proportion, again, outside of those places that were hit especially hard. It was not necessary.
I think they realize, Justin, that they didn't they can't. And then talk about will people believe, Donnie, you asked, will people believe experts anymore? Will they believe the models? The problem here is it's like the people are not as stupid as our governments think they are. They can actually read things, they can perceive things, they can talk amongst themselves, they can actually experience reality and have that affect what they think about things and not just what they are told by experts. And they will come to realize that, there were a lot of other experts out there. There's lots of experts, and experts often say contradictory things. Our government only listens to the experts that give advice that results in the least amount of freedom for you and for me and for everybody listening to this as possible. And that's exactly what happened here. The climate models that, Heartland has been pointing out that the modeling, the computer models for modeling what the climate's going to be like have been, being made for 20 years. Well, we're 20 years past those things, and we can see what the climate actually looks like. And it doesn't look anything like the model said it did. It's not nearly as warm. The sea levels are not nearly as high, and all of those sorts of factors. With this COVID thing, people have discovered, in a few months, and it's affected their lives personally. With COVID, on the models did not match up with reality, and it really affected and harmed, my life, my business, my ability to say goodbye to my mother on her deathbed, and things like that. You noted, Donnie, that I did get a haircut, and it does look fantastic. And the woman who cuts my hair, she asked me, and we only could have 10 people at a time in the haircuttery place. I had to wait outside. I had to have my temperature taken, and I had to have a mask on, and she's cutting her hair, and I haven't seen her in 3 months. So it was nice to catch up and ask her how she's doing. And she has a mask on. I have a mask on, and we're chatting. And she asks me, she says, do you think it's safe for me to go outside with my mask and take a walk in the nature preserve by my house? Because she was told by her government and I guess her friends and what she reads that doing that is dangerous. The healthiest thing you could do during this COVID pandemic is go outside in the sunshine and in the nice warm breeze and take a walk. People have been locked up for 3 months, and she was literally not sure that she could go outside and take a walk in the woods without a mask on. And now she realizes, yeah, you know what? That is kind of silly. That doesn't make any sense. And this is what's going to happen all across the country. People are going to understand that their government and these experts were wrong, and they were always wrong in the way that made life more difficult for you and took away your freedom. And this is an opportunity for those of us who love freedom and advance freedom and free markets and more liberty to point this out as a perfect example of why bigger government is very dangerous for you.
Yeah, you know what? To quote my favorite climate alarmist, how dare you for getting us off track and talk about coronavirus.
How dare you?
There you go, Andy. I was trying to set it right up for you, Andy. To talk about coronavirus for the last half hour. We were supposed to be talking about, the protests and the riots, and I make that distinction purposefully. But one of the questions that I did pose back during, it seems like coronavirus was so long ago. It seems like it's ancient history. It's still obviously going on or whatever. But it was like, how is society going to change from all of this? And I think that we can kind of have the same question with all of this other stuff going on right now. And one of the things that apparently has been happening is an expansion of people and them exercising their Second Amendment rights. Okay, so I mean, I've got like anecdotal evidence, and I've got some evidence here. There's an article that said that that during like April and May, there was a record number of firearm sales in the first part of the year. More than 2 million Americans became first-time gun owners. That's according to a firearms trade association. So it seems like kind of the inherent instability, that's the word I'm looking for, of society has really encouraged people to basically take it upon themselves to be able to protect themselves. Have you guys noticed this? Because I've had some friends and family that I never would have thought would ever have talked about getting guns have been talking about that recently. Isaac, you've not really a gun person, even though I always accuse you of being one. Have you noticed this trend too?
Yeah, and it was interesting because obviously it was the Minneapolis Police Department that killed George Floyd. And during the unrest that followed that, there was a lot of people in South Minneapolis where I used to live. So the grocery store that I used to go to got, broken into, fires, just a lot of the stuff got stolen. But there's a neighborhood over there where the citizens banded together in order to form their own like neighborhood watch. They put up barricades and stuff like that. So like I do think that the Second Amendment got I don't know, like people appreciate it more now. They appreciate the fact that like, oh, look, the cops might not always be there for you. So you're going to have some sort of means of defending yourself. So yeah, I think so.
Yeah, I mean, I made the case. Justin and I made a video where we said that I think any argument basically against the Second Amendment in general is over. I mean, the whole idea that these why would you ever need a firearm? It's like, well, maybe if the police are preoccupied with their department getting burned down, then I might have to defend myself if somebody targets my house.
Yeah, I know there's been accounts of business owners. Like I talked to a business owner who said that, yeah, I knew that I had to stay at my shop and make sure that people didn't break into it. I mean, people boarded up their shops with plywood all along the area that I live in. And he's like, yeah, I had to show a weapon to people who were going to try and break into my shop, and they decided not to. So yeah, because if you call the cops in a situation like that, they're not going to get there before people actually, break into your store and take your stuff. So yeah, I think that people are going to appreciate that in a way that maybe they didn't before.
Right. Justin, Jim, have you experienced the same thing talking to friends and family? I mean, is there that urge out there for people to, not be reliant on a police force, have to defend themselves?
Go ahead, Jim.
Well, I mean, in the county that I live in, one of the largest cities in the county, it's more rural. It's not Cook County. And the largest city in the county got, there was a little bit of looting and rioting there. And that's kind of where it started and ended. And I saw that somebody had joked on Twitter. It's like, yeah, because they realize that everybody else in the county has guns. And so they're not going to be going to any other towns or any other neighborhoods after that. Yeah, I think this is actually, yeah, you can see on Twitter, there was a image of people, 50 people, social distancing, 50 people online at a gun shop on Long Island. It was a 2-hour wait, and nobody was going to be leaving. They were going to stay there so they could get their firearms and protect their homes and their families. When you see what is happening on the streets of so many cities in the United States, where the police just can't help and protect you, people are getting beaten down late at night by these rioters. Places of business are being completely ransacked. Not just big places like Macy's or the Apple Store in New York and that sort of thing, but small businesses owned many times by minorities that have their entire lives poured into this thing. And within a matter of minutes, it's all gone. All of it is gone. And so I think there are a lot of people in this country that are thinking, yeah, you know what? At the end of the day, the police aren't there to protect you. They can't be everywhere to protect you. And you are the first line of defense. So I think you're going to see a big uptick in the purchase of firearms all across the country.
Okay, two things. One, I don't want people to interpret what I'm saying as get your guns and go patrol the streets yourselves.
No,
Not
don't patrol the
suggesting
streets.
Right.
Protect yourself and your people and your business.
that. Absolutely. And number two, did you refer to people being in line as online? Is that a
Yeah,
thing?
that's how you say it in New York. Yeah, you say you're online. I was born in New York City. Sometimes that comes out. Yes, you're
Okay.
online if you're from New York City, not in line.
We got to end that. That's terrible. You are in line. You are part of the line. The line
Right.
is the people. When you say online, that suggests being like on the internet.
I know.
Well, Jim was born before, the color television was invented. So we got to give him some leeway there, Don.
Yeah, that's close. My mother, who listens to this podcast, will be really tickled that I said online instead of inline. So there you go.
Justin, you're like an East Coast guy. Do you say online too when you mean inline?
I absolutely do not, Donald.
Okay, thank goodness.
Absolutely
So, all right, at
not.
least we dealt with something. We cleared something up on this podcast. Yeah, Justin, you're the only one that didn't weigh in on this.
Yeah, so I don't have any personal. I don't know anyone personally who's suddenly decided that they're going to buy a gun or anything like that. But the vast majority of people that I know outside of work are a bunch of far left liberals anyway. So,
well, how about them? What do they say?
Interestingly, they're scared. They're afraid, but I don't get the sense that they want to do anything about it. I think a lot of the people who I talk to feel like this is all very justified. It's justified anger. And as a result of that, they're afraid of what's happening to the point where they won't walk outside at night, for example. But they don't want to defend themselves either because they don't think that that's, the right way to handle things.
All right, so how about this video? Andy, you have that one video that I think Jim sent around. This is a couple of kids that are, there's a protest walking past their house.
Andy,
and they are in
you there?
support of it. And they're giving a thumbs up to these people that are walking past. Go ahead and play it. See what happens. So he's giving a thumbs up, and then the protesters, I don't know if they think that they're getting like the middle finger raised to them. They start throwing rocks through the windows.
We're on your side.
There's one. Oh, there's a second one. Oh,
We're on your side.
language, please. All right, go ahead and press stop on that. So it's like you could be completely on their side. We're on your side, they're shouting. What happens if, what happens if the protests start rioting into that person's house? You gonna plead with them? No, we're on your side. You have to be able to defend yourself. You have to.
Yeah, you got to be able to defend yourself. It's and the thing about it, it's really amazing to me that anyone disagrees, because we already know that half the country roughly supports the Second Amendment. And half the country, let's just say, doesn't support the Second Amendment as much as the other half. Some of those people do support the Second Amendment, but to varying degrees. Okay, let's say that that's true. All of these people who protest, though, who are protesting, whether, rightly or wrongly, because some of them are doing it for reasons that are not necessarily altruistic. Many of them are doing it for altruistic reasons. But the vast majority of them are protesting because why? They don't trust the police, right? That's why they're protesting. They're mad about who the police are, right? They don't trust them. Who are the police? The police are the government, aren't they?
Right.
So the same people who are telling us we don't need the Second Amendment to protect ourselves because we can just trust that the police will do it are telling us that the police are so untrustworthy that they're murdering innocent people in the streets. So which is it? Are the police, am I supposed to rely on the police whenever I have a problem? Or am I supposed to so distrust the police that I think they're a bunch of murderers and maybe we should disband them? I can't figure out what I'm supposed to believe here. So I think at bare minimum, what we're all sharing, whether we recognize it or not, is that there is a distrust in the centralization of power and authority over us. Right? To varying degrees. You have people who are very concerned that the police have too much power and that they're abusing that power. Now, whether that's happening everywhere or only some places or whatever, that's not the point. The point is that's what they believe. And what I believe, and what everyone who supports the Second Amendment believes, is that there's a legitimate chance that the government might abuse its power, and we should have some kind of recourse as citizens to prevent that from happening. So in reality, we actually all agree on this same exact point. We are distrustful of the centralization of power and authority in our lives. We don't want the only people with guns to be people who are in government, because they have so much power over us that they could abuse it. We may disagree on how they abuse it or why they abuse it or all that other stuff. That's sort of irrelevant to the point. The point is they could abuse it. And that's why the Second Amendment is there, in case they abuse it. That's the whole point. So should you trust the government is really the question you should ask when you're talking about the Second Amendment. And everyone here seems to agree we shouldn't trust the government. So isn't that an important point? I mean, I feel like it's so lost in this debate, but we actually all agree on that one key issue.
It doesn't even to me, that's not even the winning argument. I get it. I believe in what you're saying there, but I think the what has happened in the last week has demonstrated that you can't count on the police to be there to save you. That's the point. That's the point that I would walk away with this. I think that's the point that your average person, not to try to fend off some tyrannical government. That seems like a very abstract thing to the.
It's not abstract to the people protesting in the streets who think that the government is tyrannical.
Sure.
That's their whole point. Their whole argument is that they're all a bunch of tyrants.
But what doesn't seem abstract is a riot potentially going down somebody's neighborhood and perhaps targeting somebody's home, and you need to be able to defend yourself. After all of this stuff, that doesn't seem to be abstract. So
no, I would agree with that. I think what's so funny about that video is that the mob doesn't care if you're on their side or not. You can't reason with a mob. They don't care. They don't want to hear what you have to say. They want to throw a rock through your window. And by the way, whoever threw that rock, I mean, maybe Major League Baseball is coming back pretty soon. They should think about tracking that guy down. He threw a strike up 3 stories from the sidewalk. Bam, bam! Didn't miss either of them. That guy's got a great arm. And
one window and then the next.
Huh?
You got one window and then the next.
I know,
perfect.
bam, and then of course when the guy pulls back because he has to get away from the window, or he would have got the rock right in the forehead. Is that they were playing a game of beer pong. It's like they've been locked in their house for 3 months. They finished all their video games. Dude, the only thing on TV is the riots. What do you want to do? Hey, let's play some beer pong. That to pass the time. I mean, those kids like, bro, we're on your side. The mob can't be reasoned with. And that is the reason why, again, being able to protect your person is so important. I mean, imagine if they didn't realize that getting the attention of violent people on the streets was going to have such a negative consequence. They thought putting their thumb up like this in the window was some sort of talisman that would have prevented them from being assaulted. But that's not what the mob does. The mob doesn't care who you are.
Violent until they started throwing the rocks, though.
Yeah. Well, I mean, because you can't reason with a mob.
Let's jump into that Institute for Justice piece, Donald. How about you transition us over?
Okay, well, yeah, sure. I mean, I will say before that again, I want to make the distinction between the protests and the riots.
Yeah, okay? Absolutely.
And I think that there has been a lot of, for as terrible as videos out there, there's a lot of good videos where there's bad actors that are being brought to justice by protesters themselves. And there was one video of these vandals. I don't know if they're Antifa types or whatever, where they had the spray paint, and there was a protester that went and took the spray paint from them and basically told them to go home, which was fantastic. There's another one where there's a video of a protester calling out this one kid, again, like this LARPer, live action role player vandal, from defacing statues and totally dressed them down. It was fantastic. Or another one where there's a kid breaking up a part of the road, and one of the protesters drags him to the police, gives him to the police because this type of chaos doesn't go hand in hand with protesting. Okay, so that's why I want to make the big distinction between the riots and the protests themselves. But yeah, so what goes hand in hand in all of this is the idea of police reform or the justice system reform. And the Heartland Institute has talked about reform things, over the course of its life. One being civil asset forfeiture. Civil asset forfeiture is the legal process law enforcement agencies use to take personal assets from individuals suspected of a crime. So you don't have to be charged with anything. You just be suspected of a crime, and they could take your property away from you. So obviously this process can be abused. Property is seized from a victim, and the victim is essentially treated as guilty until proven innocent. So Heartland has worked for years on, bringing civil asset forfeiture reform to states across the country. There's been varying degrees of success on that front. We've touched on topics like mandatory minimums, overcriminalization, the war on drugs. So we have a history of acknowledging and working to solve problems in our justice system. And there's also a lot of peers of the Heartland Institute that have also been in this realm. Cato Institute does a lot of stuff on this. Mercatus Center has touched on it. Isaac, does Center for American Experiment, they do anything that's related to this?
Not really. It's interesting because the organization's grown a lot in the last few years, so we're still kind of fleshing out what we're working on. But no, I would say that this isn't one of the biggest things that we work on.
Okay. And one of the other peers that, we featured work on this podcast from a lot is the Institute for Justice. So the Institute for Justice, they have like a whole page dedicated to the idea of qualified immunity. Okay, so Institute for Justice refers to qualified immunity as a set of legal doctrines which makes it nearly impossible for ordinary Americans to hold the government accountable in court when government officials violate our constitutional rights. So, Justin, you and I were talking about this. You were actually kind of telling me about this before I even found this IJ stuff. Can you explain kind of the debate that goes on here? Because it's not as simple as it might seem right off the bat, right?
Right. So the idea of qualified immunity is that in order for the government to actually function properly, in order to have people who are going to serve in government, you have to provide those people with some degree of legal immunity from liability lawsuits and from other forms of legal action against them, because otherwise, how could the government possibly function without that? So to give you an example, let's say that you call the fire department to come to your home, right? And the fire department, because you have a fire, your house is on fire. The fire department, for whatever reason, takes too long to get to your home. They tried, but they took too long, and your house burns down. Should you be able to sue the fire department for taking too long? What about 911? If you call 911 and you have someone breaking into your house or something, and the 911 operator accidentally sends the police to the wrong address, should you be able to sue 911 for that? I mean, you can imagine how once you start thinking these things through, you realize there's all sorts of circumstances where you would be able to bring, without qualified immunity, you'd be able to bring the government lawsuits against the government constantly, all the time. And government just wouldn't be able to operate effectively without it. So there are some exceptions to this. It's not just, qualified immunity. There's nothing the government can never be held accountable for anything it ever does. That's not true. There are times the Supreme Court has fleshed these things out. There are certain circumstances where they can be held accountable. Namely, if your constitutional rights are being violated very clearly, you can be held accountable for that. There's other things. But the point is, we want people to be able to go into public service without fear of making a mistake and then being sued and their lives being destroyed. Otherwise, we really can't have government. It just wouldn't work. So on the other hand, there's a fear that if it's too widespread, if qualified immunity is too widespread, then what happens is you get people who are violating people's rights, and they're not being held accountable for it, right? So we want to try to balance those two things. That's what we want to do. And over the past several decades, courts have been trying to find that balance, and they haven't really figured out exactly where that is. And they're still kind of working on it, because that's how a lot of these cases end up happening over a very long period of time. But I think that's really where the debate is. Some people believe, more libertarian-minded people especially, and some people on the far left too, who are concerned about police and other things. They believe that qualified immunity has gone too far, and we've allowed government to get away with too much. And then on the other side, we've got people who say, well, we can't just get rid of qualified immunity, because if we do that, then government can't even function properly.
Mm-hmm.
And that's really, I think, where the debate is on the issue.
Yeah, I mean, I was watching a interview between a couple of guys from the Institute for Justice, and they were kind of breaking down qualified immunity, and they were kind of showing like the examples of it seemingly going too far, and like this person's house just essentially being destroyed because they thought that there was a potential criminal inside, and there was no criminal inside. The house was empty, and it was like that person had no recourse because of that. So it seems to be an issue that obviously, like I said, some of our peers have been talking about, and it's drawn support. There's proposals that are out there that have drawn support from Democrats as well as some Republicans. So I think that there is a discussion is to be had on this topic. Isaac, I mean, you want to you requested I brought this up, so you have anything to add to that?
Well, I just kind of wanted to shift the conversation to, okay, we know that this is a problem. How do we start like trying to address it? So I think that, even liberal outlets are starting to look at, collective bargaining agreements for police unions and saying, okay, well, you can't fire any of the bad people. I mean, there are bad cops, there are bad public employees, and the way that the unions are structured now, there's no way to really get rid of them. So how do we go about doing things that will actually change? Because we talk about, the governor of Minnesota talks about, we want to have a just and more inclusive and equitable, government. But how do you weed out the bad apples if you have no power to get rid of them, right? Like, how do you actually make a change to these institutions that have people that shouldn't be carrying a gun, that shouldn't be wearing a badge? You can't do that unless you start to actually make some meaningful reform, and holding police officers accountable for their own actions through reform to qualified immunity has to be part of that conversation.
Yeah. You brought up the public sector unions, and we've talked about education unions, like teacher unions, and how hard it is to get rid of a teacher that has done egregiously bad things. So yeah, like there's definitely solutions there. I want to like get past this idea that like all Republicans or libertarians ever do is just like dog bad ideas. There are conversations to bring in reforms from our side of the aisle. Justin and I had a discussion about healthcare. We're always against like universal healthcare or whatever. Well, there are some healthcare reforms that could introduce good policy solutions instead of just kind of following wrong ones down the road. And so for every like bad proposal that's out there, like I saw, Isaac, maybe you saw this too. There was like a Minneapolis city council person on Twitter talking about how they're going to look into disbanding the police force of Minneapolis.
Oh yeah, there's a couple of them. My ward member talked about it on our Twitter feed. I was kind of looking through that, and from what I saw from her, she seemed like she was walking back on the idea a little bit. So the idea in Minneapolis right now is we're going to disband our Minneapolis Police Department, and we're going to go to like kind of a grassroots network of like neighborhood peace officers, which I'm not sure what that means. To me, that's a little concerning because it's such a ambiguous idea. But in a lot of ways, it's, it is what Justin talked about, where people are taking more responsibility for their own personal safety. But, go ahead.
To that point, so I was looking at like one of the Twitter feeds, I forget who it was or whatever, and they were suggesting that. And obviously there's people like me and Jim. I saw him shaking his head over there. That's just like, what a preposterous idea, right? So I looked down a little bit further, like, no, this has actually been done before. Look at Camden, New Jersey. So I was like, all right, well, look at Camden, New Jersey. If this is a real possibility, fantastic, right? Let's look into it. So I looked it up and I found this like City Lab article. I'll post it. And it kind of, it's this idea that like, that it was Camden, New Jersey was really bad. So they needed to reform their police or whatever. So they essentially did disband it, quote unquote, but established like immediately after another police force.
Yeah.
And then basically the only real difference was differences in practices, right? So that's like just something that could be done at a local level, So
yeah.
Sounds like charter schools to me.
Well, it's just like let's use guns as a means of last resort. Okay, great. I don't think you need to disband the whole police department to initiate something.
No,
like that.
well, they probably, honestly, similar to the charter school thing, they probably do have to do stuff like that because of union contracts and other things like that. It's probably really hard to get out of that stuff. And so it's easier, just like with charter schools, right? Why don't, if you're willing to have charter schools in your city, that means that you know that there's a problem with your public school system, right? So why not just make the reforms that charter schools make and just have more freedom locally in these different schools? Why? Because they can't. That's why. So they allow charter schools instead, and that's where all the innovation happens. And then the regular public school system continues trudging on with all their ridiculous rules and union contracts and things that have been holding them back forever. So I think in a way that's kind of a similar approach, right? It's like, well, we don't want to have a problem with the police union, and we don't know what to do about these police union contracts and all this. So let's just get rid of this whole system and we'll just start over. And we won't call it the Minneapolis police or whatever it is, the Camden police. Will just create a new thing that's the same exact thing. It's just a change that we want to make. It's just a roundabout way of making it happen because of union contract. Public sector unions cause so much trouble. And this is just another example of it. They're so inflexible. They make it very difficult to have these kinds of changes happen quickly. And this is another example of why that's the case. I mean, yes, everyone here, everyone on this podcast, everybody at Heartland, everybody at the Center for the American Experiment, all over the country, conservative think tanks, Republicans, whatever, there's nobody that supports defending bad police officers. No one. And the right has actually been leading the charge on things like civil asset forfeiture and stuff like that for years. That's reining in the police. That's what that is. And so we've been leading that charge. We've been talking about that for decades. And we do care about reining in the police. We don't want the police being out of control or any government agency for that matter. But the solution is not to just disband it. I mean, I don't know that that's necessarily the easiest way to deal with it. There are other ways to deal with it, but I'm glad that we brought up those things because it is important that we do something. As Isaac said, it's not like we're just saying, well, just leave the system as it is. No. Yeah.
No, I mean, we have to give ideas that could potentially fix this. And I think that if we don't contribute to this, then we are part of the problem. But if you don't look at things that have a pretty good shot at working, like reforming the unions or like maybe even getting rid of the police unions, which isn't a popular thing for Republicans to do because a lot of times the police unions or the fire unions support Republican candidates. So like it's very interesting how those fault lines fall. I was in Wisconsin when they did Act 10, which reformed public sector unions for teachers and everybody else, except they had a carve out for police and fire. So like this is very politically charged, but I think if everybody was willing to just kind of put down the, our team versus their team situation and say, look, all of these things need to get addressed. Let's make a deal. I think that you can actually, start to move forward in a productive way.
Well, it's the problem of like that kind of soundbite mentality, right? All you hear is, disband the police.
Yeah.
It's like, okay, great. So now, of course, anyone's hearing that thinks like, you're just going to have no police? Like, what are you talking about? So yeah, it's like, we have to have these policy, kind of these nuanced conversations. They're talking even with the qualified immunity. Like obviously, some people suggest that it goes way too far, but as Justin was pointing out, completely getting rid of it or whatever doesn't seem like a solution either. So it's like these things have to be talked about. Opening up dialogue is the first step towards coming up with a real solution. Jim, top that.
I can't top that, but I would just add one quick point, and it's that as crazy as the idea of disbanding the Minneapolis Police Department and replacing with some kind of community, beefed up community forces or whatever. I mean, as radical as that sounds, and a lot of people would roll their eyes at it in the beginning, it does at least give a municipality some leverage over breaking up these public sector unions, because public sector unions, police unions, they don't just, protect the police officers in their jobs and they're giving their pensions and things like that. it's obviously very clear that they actually suppress accountability. That you can have bad cops continually on the street. And so it's not just that, it's that they suppress, and that's the opposite of accountability.
Yeah.
And it's the same thing with the teachers unions. I mean,
Exactly.
you can look it up and Google it. There are teachers in New York City who are paid to do nothing. They are such terrible teachers and have done abusive things, but they can't be fired. So they report to the school, sit in what they call the rubber room, and just twiddle their thumbs for 8 hours, and then they go home, and they're paid very handsomely to do it. And that's another public sector union protection that just suppresses accountability. It's the opposite of what we need.
Yeah, right. Yeah, I mean the public teachers unions and the power that they wield or whatever has been like a target of our ire for a long time. Is it because teachers are inherently bad or something? No, it's the side effects of these overly powerful public sector unions that basically allow for these kind of abuses to happen. So if you could recognize that with teachers unions, you could recognize that with police unions too. So send all of your hate mail to Jim Lakely. Send it all to Jim Lakely. Don't send it to me. Gentlemen, any last words before we sign off for the week? Damn you, Andy. All right, fantastic. Everyone, thank you for joining us for this episode of the In the Tank podcast. If you like our show, please subscribe, rate, review for us on iTunes. That'd be greatly appreciated. You can find us in SoundCloud, Stitcher, Google Play, YouTube, pretty much everything nowadays. If you'd like, you can follow us on Twitter at In the Tank Pod. If you would like to send us your comments, suggestions, questions, everything but hate mail, feel free to email us at inthetankpodcast at gmail.com. Don't look at the graphic. Andy got that wrong. Isaac, where can the fine people find you?
On Twitter at the Fracking Guy.
Fantastic. Justin, same question.
At Justin C. Haskins on Facebook and Twitter.
And Jim Lakely, where can the fine people find you?
At Jay Lakely on Twitter, at Heartland Inst, and also End the Lockdown.
Thank you all for tuning in. We will talk to you next week.